So I'd like to have you all stand up. And some of you have probably done this little exercise before, and if you have, you know, my expectations are very high that you'll have the answer this time. So, so what I'd like to do is ask you to think back to your last electricity bill. Should we pause and meditate on that? I don't know. But think back. Visualize it in your head. And if you know, roughly, how many kilowatt hours of electricity you used on your last electricity bill, stay standing, and everybody else, I'd like you to sit down. No. All right, this is definitely an improvement. I'm very impressed. So my next question is, if you know how your kilowatt hour consumption number compares to other people in your neighborhood, stay standing, and otherwise please sit down.
How precisely do we have to know?
All customers? Oh, we'll keep in the all customers, that's fine. Okay, all right, well, very good. Thank you very much. I'll let everybody sit down at this point. So I think that this is a really good exercise, particularly in a room full of people who are working in this field, to realize, you know, if we don't know how much electricity we're consuming, if we don't know how much energy we're consuming, how do we really expect that other people are going to be aware of how much energy they're consuming and actually do something to change that pattern of behavior that's creating that level of energy consumption? So what's so important about feedback is that it allows us to manage what is otherwise an invisible resource. And we all know that unlike in previous eras, you know, energy is largely invisible to us today. It's no longer like it used to be when, you know, in order to heat our home, we were either chopping wood or shoveling coal. It just invisibly enters our house. We don't see our use of it. It's completely invisible to us. The same thing with light. You know, we don't fill an oil lamp in order to get the light we need to see, and therefore we don't have this physical interaction anymore with our energy sources. The electricity just silently and invisibly comes into our homes. And the irony or the paradox associated with that is that as it's become easier and easier, and as energy has become less visible, we use so much more. And it reminds me of, I'm trying to remember whose presentation was it with the water, and the little kids who made the video, right, with the water and the that was your presentation? Yeah. So I saw that and I was thinking, that's exactly right. You know, I mean, here we have this abundant resource, and we don't, and it's invisible, and so we don't think about how much we're using. So really, at this point in terms of electricity, the only way that we really have to assess how much we use is the bill that we get at the end of the month. And it's not very effective. And a lot of people, you know, have thought about this in a way akin to grocery shopping, right? What if we went to, every time we went to the grocery store, we filled up our cart and we got to the cash register and they told us how much our total bill was, but you had there was no price on the shelf for any individual item, and you didn't get an itemized receipt, you just paid for your cart full of groceries. It'd be pretty hard to know whether or not it was the salmon or the potato chips or the apples that were really adding up to be that large bill that you got at the end, and you wouldn't really know what to cut back on in order to reduce your bill, right? And so feedback is a means of really giving people those kinds of insights so that they can be more aware, so they can be more mindful about their energy use. So what this graph shows is, for all of you who remained standing at the end of that exercise, I'm sorry, but you're not normal. But that's okay, because neither am I. And most of the people in this room aren't, right? Whether or not you sat down at the first question. Because most people, this is not something that's at the top of their minds. I think the other point that I want to make with this chart, basically what this chart shows is average monthly electricity consumption per household by state in 2009. So each one of those bars is a different state. And so for those people who knew or who know your kilowatt hour consumption, anybody want to share? I should have asked you before I showed you the average.
Around 650.
650. Okay, great.
Which is very high for
Anyone else? 80 a month? Wow. We're going to all be talking to you after this session. 280. All right. Ooh, I think we should have a contest. What's the prize? Okay, I'm adding this to my talk next time.
628, but 250 of it's electric car.
Very good, electric car. Okay, well, I think that this is, you just made my point. Thank you very much. We are not normal. As you can see, the US average is 908 kilowatt hours per household per month. So the other thing that I think is really important with this graph is that the amount of variation. Even if you're just looking at averages by state, the amount of variation is very significant. Anywhere from an average of 521 kilowatt hours in Maine to 1,273 in Louisiana. So that's a difference of 2.4 times. And that's just, again, state averages. The variation within those states is even larger. So if you're wondering what the average is for your state, I have a subset of some of the states here. New York's average is 610 kilowatt hours per month, and Colorado's is 709 kilowatt hours per month. So I'll give you, anybody who wants the full table, I'll give you that later on. I'm not going to talk a lot about the smart grid, but I think it's important to mention that one of the wonderful things about the smart grid is that it really is increasing our opportunity to do a lot more with feedback because of the information that the smart grid is making available to us. And this is just a graphic illustration of what the smart grid looks like. I know we're not normal in this room, so I expect you all to know what the smart grid is. One note about advanced meters is that advanced meters, also known as smart meters, again, they're a really important tool for providing more people with more feedback. But the interesting thing here is that there is a general misperception among the public that when they get smart meters, that they're going to get their data automatically, that they're going to have access to their data. I was involved with some focus group research in a nationwide study where we went to 3 different cities, 6 different focus groups to talk to people about the smart grid. This was part of the Smart Grid Consumer Collaborative. And it was interesting to me that when we talked to people about their perceptions of the smart grid and smart meters, that they were really excited. I mean, I know that a lot of the things that you read in the press are all the anxiety that certain people have around smart meters. But our findings suggested that, in fact, people were really excited about this technology. But one of the main reasons they were excited about it was that they were excited about the possibility of actually having access to their information. And it was only at the very end of this focus group research where we started talking to people about feedback mechanisms, in-home displays and other kinds of feedback mechanisms that would actually provide them with that information. And it was interesting because people got really upset at that point. And they got really upset because all along they were assuming that they would get it as soon as they had a smart meter, that they didn't realize there was this extra step that was required and that most utilities weren't providing that technology to people. And so they became very upset when they found that out. So as I said, what I really want to focus on today is a meta-review, a meta-analysis that I did while I was with ACEEE that looked across 57 different feedback initiatives to try and understand a variety of things. And our specific research questions are presented here. And I'm not going to talk about all of them today. So the ones that I'm going to focus on are the first four, which is how much electricity have households saved as a result of having feedback. How do the savings that people achieve through the use of feedback vary by the type of feedback? Whether or not there are direct or indirect forms of feedback are better, and is feedback more effective when it's combined with, or I should say, when it's combined with programs that actually integrate social science research insights? And then lastly, what are the potential national level savings of feedback-induced energy savings? And I should say that this report is available online and can be downloaded free of charge, and I'll give you that web address. So what did the study look like? As I said, we looked across 57 different feedback initiatives. They span several continents and 9 countries. You can see that the majority of them were in the United States, but a good proportion of them were also in Europe and Canada, and then there were a few in Asia, in Japan. These studies spanned a range of years, from 1974 to 2010. 21 of the studies were in what we called the energy crisis era between 1974 and 1994. Actually, the majority of those were between 1974 and 1985 because there was very little in the 10 years after that. And then 36 of the studies were in the period in 1995 to 2010, what we call the climate era. What did we find? In terms of how the savings related to the type of feedback, we were looking at 5 different types of feedback: enhanced billing, estimated feedback, daily, weekly, real-time feedback, and real-time plus. The enhanced billing type of feedback is where households are getting basically paper statements in addition to their regular electricity bill that provide them with a bit more information. And typically, the kind of information that those types of statements provide is a comparison of your electricity consumption with either your historical consumption or with another reference group, either your neighborhood or a state average or something along those lines, so that you're able to benchmark and to know not just how am I doing, but to know how you're doing relative to other people or to your historical average. With that type of feedback, we saw an average program-wide savings of, and this is across programs, of 3.8%, so just under 4%. The second type of feedback that we looked at was estimated feedback. And this is basically where people that are participating in the feedback program are collecting their data themselves. They're reading their meters and they're actually providing the data, as opposed to the first kind where the information is generally coming from the utility. So that type of feedback generated average savings of just under 7%. The third kind is daily weekly feedback. And this is where households are given information either on a daily basis or on a weekly basis. Typically, the information comes from utilities, and that type of feedback generated 8.4% savings. And then of the real-time feedback, and of course real-time just means that you're basically getting that information instantaneously as opposed to a week later or a month later through these other kinds of reporting, the savings were even greater, obviously. 9.2% for whole house level feedback, and this is generally through in-home displays that you have in the house, and 12% for real-time plus, which is not just whole house feedback, but where you can actually monitor some plug loads and get information about what's happening at the appliance level. So what's interesting here, I think, is this distinction between indirect and direct feedback. And as we can see from the chart, just by looking at this, we can see that the level of savings are much higher for direct feedback. So that, that often leads to the question, does that mean that direct feedback is always better? And the answer is no, it's not always better. What I think we need to keep in mind is that they both have a purpose, and that indirect and direct forms of feedback tend to influence behaviors in different ways. So indirect feedback tends to help people see these larger patterns of energy use. If you think, well, let me start with the direct feedback. So direct feedback, what I think is one of the most interesting things, what happens when, and somebody was telling me this story, I can't remember who, when you get an in-home display, what most people do is they run around and they start turning things on and off, right? They'll put the television on, and then they'll turn it off, and they'll see in real time what kind of impact that had. Same thing with the computer, right? So they're teaching themselves. They're running around and they're learning about how all these devices in their homes actually are contributing, right? It's sort of that shopping cart analogy. How are those contributing to that larger energy bill? And that's really useful information. But what it doesn't necessarily show you very easily is what is the impact of having your daughter or son who's been off to college move back in with you when they graduate and can't find a job? How much of the shift in your electricity bill is associated with your mother-in-law coming to live with you, right? How much of it is associated with that new furnace that you installed? Or how much of it is associated with seasonal changes in your need to use air conditioning or maybe electric heating? And it's really the indirect feedback that can provide you that kind of picture. And so it's, so what ideally, right, in the ideal world, you would actually have both because they provide you with different kinds of information. And in fact, more and more kinds of feedback are providing both. So the next question is really, how does program design matter? And we were interested in looking at a variety of program design factors. There's been a lot of research in the social science field that has looked at social norms and goal setting and the use of commitments and how those things shape whether or not somebody is motivated, engaged in doing something with that information, right? So it's one thing to have the information, it's something else to be motivated to actually change your behavior as a result of receiving it. And in fact, the example that I gave in terms of the Opower work is, one of the poster children, I guess, for the use of social norms. That work has built on the work of Robert Cialdini, who's a psychologist who has looked at the effect of social norms in changing people's motivation to actually change their behavior. And how many of you are familiar with Robert Cialdini's work? Okay, a good number of you. It has become very well known because, I think, in large part of the work of Opower. But what that, I mean, let me give you an example of how this matters. So in a study by Nolan and Cialdini and Wes Schultz in, I think it's 2008, they went out and they did a really simple feedback program. They had door hangers. So they went around to households and they read their meters and they put door hangers on the doors to let people know how much energy they were consuming, electricity they were consuming. But before they even did that, they asked people, what would motivate you to reduce your energy consumption? And they asked them based on 4 different factors. The first one was economic. Of these selections, which is going to be the most motivating? Economic, the environment. This was a study that was done in California, so they were asking people about social considerations because there had been a lot of blackouts and brownouts. Are you worried about that happening in your community? Or is there something else that would really motivate you to reduce your electricity consumption? What do you think the number 1 answer was? How many people think it was reducing my energy bill, my electricity bill? How many people think it was the environment? How many people think it was this social responsibility? Okay, I'm sort of cheating because the last option was, it depends on, I want to know what my neighbors are doing. If I know what my neighbors are doing, that's what's going to influence me the most. How many people think that last thing was?
Stated or actual?
Stated. So what people said was, it was the economics. People said, if it will lower my electricity bill, that's the number 1 thing that I care about. That is what is going to get me to change my behavior, reduce my energy consumption. But in fact, when they went around and did the research and put the little door hangers on the doors and then went back and measured the change in energy consumption, and this is over a period of time, guess what actually they found? They found, as some of you indicated, that it was the comparison to their neighbors that actually got people to reduce their energy consumption. And in fact, it was the only thing that created a significant change in electricity consumption. And I could tell you more stories about that, but I won't. I'll save those for another time. So there's also been a lot of research around goal setting. And the research around goal setting has indicated that both individual goals and group goals can be really important in helping people have that motivation to reduce their energy consumption. And I'll tell you the results of that in a minute. The same thing with commitments. People want to be accountable. And if you ask people to make a commitment, and particularly a public commitment or have them a written commitment, that also tends to help people to reduce their consumption level. And then lastly, this element of social context is that a lot of you were here, I think, for the last event where we had David Gershon. How many people have heard about eco-teams? So a few of you. So the whole idea of eco-teams is that you actually work in a community as a group to reduce your electricity consumption. And you go through this process of learning as a group. And in fact, that approach has been evaluated and has been shown to also boost the level of motivation and to boost the level of savings associated with these initiatives. So this is just a copy of one of the Opower energy bills. It shows here what people see when they see that, and I'm not going to go into detail because I'm sure that you're going to see that in the Opower example. But I do want to point out two things. One is that in this example, the gray line is the household's actual energy consumption. The red line shows that person compared to their neighbors. And then very importantly is the green line, which shows how people are compared to their more efficient neighbors. And the reason that that's important is that social norms have been shown to be very effective, but they can also backfire if you're not careful. Because what happens, like what might happen for most of us in this room, for the people who use less than the average, they actually have found that they'll increase their electricity consumption to be more like the average person, unless you have a different comparison group. And that's where the energy efficient neighbors come in. You can say, you know, this is how you compare to the average, but this is, you know, another point of comparison, your more efficient neighbors, and that has actually been shown to be effective to keep people from regressing to the mean. Okay, so what did we find in our study? We looked at these variables to see how, in combination with feedback, they were actually able to influence electricity savings. Unfortunately, there were only 2 studies, one for competitions and one for commitment, that actually employed those strategies in conjunction with the feedback approach, so we couldn't really assess those very well. There were 14 studies that looked at social norms and 4 that looked at goal setting. For the 14 that looked at social norms, they found a 2 to 10% electricity savings. And that's really important because if you remember, well, first of all, most of these, if you remember the 5 different types of feedback, all of these studies that have used social norms are indirect forms of feedback. So they're on the left side of that scale, the side of the scale that typically achieves lower levels of electricity savings. Most of them are enhanced billing programs. Enhanced billing programs, if you remember, save an average of about just under 4%. So for a 2 to 10% savings when you combine social norms with feedback is an important distinction. Secondly, with the goal setting, again, these were all used with indirect forms of feedback, and they were able to achieve savings of 5 to 17%. And that range is not a range across households. It's a program average. So these are program average savings of 5 to 17%, looking across programs. Okay? And then, as I said, for the competitions and commitments, we only had 1 data point, but those 2 numbers are across households. Competitions were able to save 10 to 32%, and I think, you know, that's a very dramatic level of savings, and I think that's part of the reason why a lot of people are very interested in using competitions, but there's one caveat to that, which is the question of persistence of savings. And while some of these other forms of savings are not that high, they tend to be much more persistent. So you kind of have to do that, the weighing of those 2 factors. And then lastly, the commitment level. And feedback, there was only 1 feedback study that combined feedback and commitment, and they found a 5 to 8% savings. So what I would suggest is that most of these studies are old. Most of these studies really don't integrate much in the way of social science insights, and that, in fact, if they were, and a lot of the newer ones that we'll be hearing about today, a lot of the newer feedback programs are doing that to a much greater degree, that the potential savings are much, much greater, and maybe as high as 20 to 35%. And we've seen this level of savings. I want to say there was one study in that meta-review that had a program-wide average savings level of 21 or 22%, just from feedback. 21 to 22% program average savings. And the other thing I want to emphasize here is that these are, when they looked at what people were doing to achieve those savings, it's almost 100% no cost, low cost kinds of behaviors. It's not big investments. People aren't going out and buying refrigerators. People aren't going out and buying energy efficient furnaces. So we're talking about very large levels of energy savings just as a result of receiving this information. I'm going to skip over this in the interest of time. And one of the last points I want to make is that one of the really beautiful things about feedback is that it really eliminates the need for prescriptive programs. We don't have to figure out what people should be doing. A lot of the utility programs are saying, you should get a new refrigerator, or you should do this, or you should do that. But the beautiful thing about feedback is people get to figure that out for themselves. What makes sense for them, given where they are, given their budget, given their lifestyle, given their living situation, given their house, et cetera, right? So they can figure out, they can do the experimentation, become experts themselves, and what you find when you look at what people actually do is there's a wide variety of things that people end up doing to achieve those savings, and it's different from household to household. It also, in that sense, maximizes household options. So again, instead of just thinking all I can do is get a new refrigerator or get that energy efficient appliance, it really allows for more. It allows for targeted recommendations once you have that information about how people are using energy and how much they're using. It engages people in this active learning process. So not only is it making people mindful of their electricity consumption, but it's also engaging people in a way that makes them the experts as opposed to having to rely on other people who are experts, which I think is really important. And in that sense, it really empowers people to become part of the energy solution themselves as opposed to passive bystanders. And these are just some references, and thank you very much.